All righty, can everyone hear me? Yep. Okay, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Coffee with the Curator. Before we begin, I want to thank Humanities Kansas for making today's program free to the public, and also to thank local roasters for providing us with coffee for the program. Our coffee today is Panama Bombito Estate. I would also like to ask everyone to please silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. Real quick, next month's Coffee with the Curator is July 17th, when we'll be hosting another Humanities Kansas speaker, Linda Knoll, an educator and historian from Pittsburgh, Kansas. Linda's talk is called Army of Amazons, Women's Fight for Labor Rights in Kansas's Coal Fields. She writes, in December 1921, thousands of women in southeast Kansas rose up to fight injustice in the area coal fields. These women were immigrants from European nations as well as Kansas-born. After a months-long strike by the coal miners, the women joined the cause. In the short term, their efforts crippled mine production for nearly a month. In the longer term, their continued activism impacted future statewide elections and national legislation. This talk will share the stories of these women, christened the Amazon Army by the New York Times, and their fight for democracy and labor rights in Kansas's coal fields. Today, we are delighted to host the internationally known guitarist and vocalist, Lem Sheppard. Lem is a member of the Oklahoma Blues Hall of Fame, was a national finalist in the Telluride Acoustic Blues Challenge, and a recipient of the Kansas Folklore Society's Joan O'Brien Award. He performed in South Africa at the International Eistfod, toured Brazil under the auspices of the U.S. Embassy, and a congressional committee selected him to represent Kansas at the Kennedy Center on the Millennium Stage. From 2001 to 2013, Lem performed school shows across the United States, and in 2017, he received the Meritorious Achievement Award from his alma mater, Pittsburgh State University. He has also composed the soundtrack to the PBS documentary on the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, Black and White and Brown. Without further ado, please welcome Lem Sheppard.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sometimes when I hear all that, I think it's but because I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and wound up playing guitar, like everybody else in the neighborhood. and eventually wound up at Pittsburgh State University because I have older sisters and brothers, and they went to Pittsburgh State University to be social workers. And I thought I was going to do that too, but wound up majoring in music and wound up meeting somebody there who was an artist in residence named Eva Jesse. And she sort of changed the trajectory of what thought I was going to do. I was a jazz saxophone player in those days, studying music. But she was 86, 87 years old. She grew up in Southeast Kansas, Coffeyville, Kansas. She wound up becoming world famous with Porgy and Bess and George Gershwin. And when Martin Luther King, they had the March on Washington, she was designated as the choir. So I met her at 86, 87. And just the conversations I had with her and becoming a member of her Eva Jesse choir, it just lots of light bulbs went off and things started clicking that I thought I already knew about, because I thought I already knew about jazz and blues. I read all the books on it, but she kind of threw a wrench in the works because she was from Kansas and she was teaching me songs that I didn't associate with being African American music at all. And so, but she had learned these songs from her father. And so I thought, wow, that puts this music history back to like 1870 in Kansas, maybe even further back than that. So to give you a little bit of background on how I got going down this rabbit hole, I was a good segue into Linda Knoll. I live in Southeast Kansas too, and they have the Miners Museum there. Well, the Miners Museum wanted to focus on African American miners, and they wanted me to come and present a music program, just to kind of, segue into the history. And so I knew the music because I knew the time period, and I thought I could probably pull out some songs. But I thought I'll learn a little bit of the history of Southeast Kansas and the miners and African American miners, and try to get some history. Well, first thing I came on was a man named Walter Montgomery. He was a black miner who died in the mines, and he was obviously very well respected because at his funeral they had 5 or 6 African American cornet bands that played at his funeral, which was typical in those days, 1900, 1908, and all those periods. There were cornet bands. Well, these were African American cornet bands from the surrounding communities, little mining towns, little mining camps, and each one of them had a cornet band. And I knew that there were also bands like in Pittsburgh and Girard. And so I began to wonder where all these bands,
You just use the mic for him.
oh, okay. And I wondered, where all these bands came from and this whole history of bands. And so I thought, I got to study that history. So I started looking at Kansas and music history in Kansas and just looking at old newspapers. So that was in 2017. And that's what sent me down this path of researching what was going on in Kansas musically for African Americans, because it wasn't, I've been listening to music from the South. Whenever you play blues and you play jazz, you talk about Mississippi, New Orleans, and then the Harlem Renaissance, you go to New York. But what I found in Kansas, I thought rivaled any of that history. Kansas had a little bit of a head start because while the Civil War was, ending and African Americans in the South were, virtual slaves, whether they were, in slavery or out. By that time, Kansas had already, African Americans in Kansas were already starting schools and churches in Lawrence. Before the this Jubilee, singers came through in 1873, Lawrence, Kansas. They were already having concerts, entertainments. So something was going on here apart, and where it was coming from was through the railroads. The railroads were bringing all this music in. And that's what you have in front of you. This Bandana Land, this was a very popular show that came through the whole country. Williams and Walker, Burt Williams and Nash Walker were world famous. Nash Walker was from Lawrence, Kansas. They had been all over the world, and this was one of their shows. And Alex Rogers, who wrote the book, he was living in Emporia, Kansas at that time. And so that was another famous name of a person. So I started looking up these famous names, like Ethel Waters. And I heard about Ethel Waters, and the Fort Scott newspaper on more than one occasion used her as an example of Fort Scott and said that we know her by another name, but while she was a little girl growing up in Fort Scott, we knew her as another name. And I read that twice. And even though her biography and is kind of loosely put together, they have a lot of years, but they don't know what happened. Her father was a railroad man. He traveled a lot. So I went on and added her name in there. But all the rest of these names, these people have notoriety outside of Kansas. Levi Payne and Perry Lowry, these were guys who became circus bands. Barnum and Bailey used some of these guys. Vance Lowry was called the Banjo King. And I learned that a lot of people who played banjo were called the Banjo King. There were many of these guys who were well known. R.G. Jackson, Nash, all S.E. Craig, first African American to have to study music and get a doctorate degree from Nicodemus. The Whitman sisters, they were the daughters of Albury Whitman. Albury Whitman was a very well-known poet, and he went out to Pratt, Kansas to preach. This is 1870s, this is that era. So all these names, have some meaning in the past, and I thought, but what about the generation of people that came before them? And what about the culture in Kansas that produced all these people? And that's what I wanted to focus on. What was it about Kansas that produced this many high quality people, as well as hundreds more? And so that's what got me thinking about how to find out what was it about Kansas. For instance, in 1885, Kansas had over 50 black newspapers, which was considered an extraordinary amount of newspapers. And I began to think, well, where did all those printing presses come from? And it came from, obviously the first people who came here, maybe the Germans, a lot, because some of the newspapers, the old newspapers are in German. And so they had to have printing presses for all those newspapers. They had benefits to open schools. So that was the Kansas from the 1870s, 1880s. And I'll give you a little bit of background on some of the facts here. 1871, the Fort Scott Daily Monitor said there were 17,000 African Americans in Kansas at that time. Not a large number, but it was more than a lot of states had. Maryland, which was one of the most populous outside of the South, had 17,980. So Kansas was a rival, right up there with outside of the South. California, Connecticut, Iowa, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont didn't have as many African Americans in them than Kansas had. And by 1902, the Wyandotte Herald said that only 25 counties in Kansas didn't have any African Americans in it. I'm going to be shuffling papers here a lot because I've done this about maybe 9 or 10 times, but I change it for every city I go to because every city has their history, and I always add in Wichita or whatever I can find. So I'll give you another bit of background, and this is I call it Gunsmoke, because we've all seen that show on television. I watched it growing up, Gunsmoke in Dodge City. The era that was in, say 1870 to 1885, in Dodge City, Kansas, there was an African American group had a dance in 1878, and they had a dance at a house, and the band that played was called the Houston Ross String Band. And I don't know if that band was black or white. In those days, it didn't matter because everybody played the same music, everybody danced to the same music. There was a Mexican band that was traveling through, a 50-piece Mexican band that traveled through Kansas. They all played the same. Oh, good. Now over here, you want me to start over? I could start over, but I'll give you a chance to ask questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of history, a little bit of background, but then I'm going to let the songs tell most of the story. But Gunsmoke, 1870 to 1885, Houston Ross String Band played with this African American group of people that had a dance, and there were lots of dances. And the songs they danced to was Bonnie Blue Flag, Arkansas Traveler, and The Girl I Left Behind. Pretty typical of what was going on in this part of the country or in America. Bismarck Grove had a lot of the temperance meetings, 1878, the reform meetings. In 1879, there was also in Kinsley, Kansas, not very far away from Dodge City, they had a literary society. There were lots of literary societies in Kansas, and African Americans had quite a few. In 1881 to 1884, the Fisk Jubilee singers would have been singing at the courthouse in Dodge City, Kansas. All the very famous vaudeville shows came through Dodge City. There was a dance hall in Dodge City also owned by an African American named James Smith. There was a couple in Dodge City in 1885, and they were married by telegraph. You know, a judge in Dodge City, Judge named Humboldt, married them by telegraph. The original Tennessee singers played it. Kelly Opera House. The black population would go to Larned, Kansas for Emancipation Days. That's where I found a lot of the culture when I looked up Emancipation Days, because this was a very popular, we have Juneteenth, but before Juneteenth, there was Emancipation Days on August the 1st or 2nd. And it was a big event all over Kansas. It began in the 1830s or 40s, but in Kansas, every town had Emancipation Days. It was a big event. Politicians came, there's entertainment. And so Dodge City had one. There was a Black Baptist church. Jetmore, Kansas also had a black band. And in 1893, the Abilene, the black people put on Beauty and the Beast. So this was during the Dodge City cowboy days. And so that was what's left out of the history, is that we think of the West and the cowboy days, but African Americans generally moved to the cities and they had houses in the cities, and we missed all that history. But that was during what we call the cowboy days. And so the music that I was looking for, I thought, well, there would be jazz and blues and spirituals and whatever. But I found maybe 12 different types of songs. There were camp meeting songs. I think camp meeting songs in America are the least researched songs, because, the camp meetings began like in Kentucky and went to New York, and then from New York into Kansas. Camp meetings, where every town had a camp meeting. And the songs that we sing in camp meeting songs, they really resemble blues. There was one of the band leaders, I saw an old sheet music that was from 1906, and he wanted a certain section of this song sang like the camp meeting songs. And he said the first verse is going to be like the chorus, and it'll come back every other verse, which is exactly the way blues music is sang today. The opening lines of the song, they come back. And this was before people went down south to find blues music. There was concerts. Lawrence had one in 1864 in a theater, and they had whatever songs were popular for concerts in those days. There were jubilee songs. That's what they called the Fisk Jubilee singers. And it was a whole class of songs called jubilee songs. And then there was gospel songs. Before we associate gospel with, after the Harlem Renaissance, 1830, there was a couple of guys named Moody and Sankey, and they were traveling through. And in Topeka, Kansas, there was an African American church there that were singing what they call Moody and Sankey gospel songs. This was a new trend in American music also. Of course, patriotic songs, Civil War era songs, barn dance songs. I saw an old ad in a Wichita paper that there was going to be a stock sale, and then there was going to be a barn dance. And the band or the orchestra that was going to play was called the Colored Orchestra, was going to be the musicians for the barn dance. And when they used the word "the," that meant it was the local group of guys. If they said a colored orchestra or a colored band, that meant they were coming from someplace else. But you'd always see the word the colored band, the colored orchestra, because every town had a group of their own band members and orchestras. There were plenty of these guys. And in 1895 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, there was an orchestra, a quartet, their string quartet. And I had their names. There were 4 African Americans. They were 2 married couples. And I asked somebody in Pittsburgh that they know the names, but the names are gone. Nobody remembers those names. But one of the churches were going to have what they called a turkey supper, and they wanted Roger de Coverley style music. And this string quartet provided that kind of music. So we think of the fiddle tunes, but they could play anything. Serenade songs. Serenading was something that was quite different. Serenading was very popular. And one of the most popular people to serenade would be the newspaper. Because they work late, and a lot of times people work late, and it's summertime, they had their windows open. So a group of serenaders would go to the newspaper, and they would serenade outside the newspaper, so that normally the guys have the radio on or whatever, but you'd have a group of guys down below serenading you. And of course, the next day in the newspaper, it would be the newspaper was serenaded by the so-and-so serenading group. They provided lovely music. A lot of times they would mention the songs that they actually sang, and that's how I picked up a lot of these songs. But sometimes a group of, and what I like to tell people is that all the places that we listen to music today, they did too, except for they would hire. If you went to the lake, you could bring a duo with you. A banjo and a mandolin player would play at the lake for the young people for $15. You wanted to drive down the street in your car listening to music, well, they would get a wagon and they would hire a couple of guys to sit in the back of the wagon while they had some refreshments to drink. And they would just go and drag the gut, as we would call it, but it would be a banjo player and a mandolin in the back playing music. So serenading was a big deal, and it was usually whatever popular songs that were in America. And these were songs that came from the vaudeville stage. Whatever songs were, you come to your town, and that was something that we didn't think about, is that was like the radio. And every little town, it seems like when they would begin a town, they would get a post office, and I guess before they got a jail, they would get an opera house, and then that's what all you needed. You'd need a post office and an opera house, because the train would come through, and every little town had an opera house, would seat maybe 1,000 people, and so you figured 25 cents to get in, and then you could make these stops all along the way. All the little towns around here, they had an opera house, and the disc jubilee singers would stop at each one, making $300 per show, which was a tremendous amount of money in 1873. And that's what encouraged every little town to have their own jubilee singers. But that's what I found. I found lots of songs. And instead of just focusing on, a handful of musicians in Kansas, I found, maybe 70 musicians, just string players in Kansas. And one of the guys was one of the professors, who played and he had a band in Fort Scott. His song list was quadrilles, waltzes, two-steps, schottisches. I'm not sure what a schottisch is. I think it's a kind of fast or slow polka. But he had a whole list of these New Berlin, quadrilles, the Harvard, and some of the Del Monte. And I talked to a dance teacher. She said that this person would have a dance school, and you would go to the dance school and learn all these dances, and then there would be a dance. But you'd have to have this list because you'd have to prepare yourself. And two African-American band leaders that you might have heard of, W.C. Handy and also Quincy Jones, in their autobiographies, they said they had to learn some of those because when they were traveling around doing dances, in the 20s or 30s even, they still had to learn those kind of dances. And this, what I'll do is I'll give you what I call the numbers. And the numbers are, and I think I have some just for Wichita too, but there was over 70 named string players in Kansas. There were 38 banjo and mandolin. They called them guitar clubs, mandolin clubs, banjo clubs. And one of the most popular was called the quartets. There were 126 different quartets from like 1880 to 1922. 60 black trios, glee clubs I found was interesting. There were lots of glee clubs. One of the most biggest number of people I found were these glee clubs. Glee clubs were different from the serenaders because glee clubs, sometimes they made up songs on the spot. They wore uniforms. They were mostly associated with politics. There'd be a rally and they'd have a glee club. Sometimes a glee club would be named after the Republican Party or the Republican candidate's party, whatever. It had that name to it. He would be speaking and he would bring his glee club with him. Brass bands, there were 21 of them, 1866 to about 1909. And that was sort of my cutoff time, about the time of jazz, because everything changed around jazz. And it wasn't just music, it was also movies. People would go to movies. Also, there were the Victrola gramophone parties. Instead of having bands, you'd invite people over and you'd play records. It was a big deal, 1909. 67 orchestras. There were home talent, 47 home talent. And these were people that in small towns had put together their own vaudeville shows. Jubilee singers, there was 50 different Jubilee singers that traveled to Kansas, and like maybe 70 of these vaudeville groups. So you could imagine how much entertainment there was. In Topeka, they said you could go out almost any night of the week and see these vaudeville shows and these jubilee singers. So even places where there's very little population, you know, like Racine, Kansas, they said every show they came through stopped off in Racine, Kansas. But I think the biggest number of all was what the public and private buildings, groves, opera houses, and saloons. And there was one black-owned opera house, but the number was 300. There were three, and I didn't count the number. I didn't count the halls that, like, if the Jubilee singers came to town and they played at a certain hall. I would only count the ones that African Americans could rent themselves in that community and pay the $9 fee and give their own dance, their own concert, their own entertainment. There was over 300 of them in Kansas, beginning in 1862 to about 1922. Here in Wichita, 1879, there was Wichita Eagle Hall. 1880, there was the Opera House in Wichita, and there was a skating rink in Wichita in 1884. And this was interesting here, because I didn't know this existed, but I guess in the old days, you'd rent the skating hall, the skating rink, and people would wear masks. There'd be a mask ball. The skaters would all put on a mask. You'd also have the band or an orchestra playing music. People would skate. And this is what one of the newspaper guys from the Beacon wrote in 1885 about attending one of these. It was called the Colored Folks Masked Count Carnival at the Rink. And he wrote, believer, infidel, and Jew, and folks of every shade and blue, the white, the black, the red, the blue, the yellow, and the gray, were there to view or to pursue the evening pleasures gay. And that was what he wrote in 1885 about attending one of these. But it was a big community event to go to one of these masked balls and have people skate wearing masquerades, something we don't see the singers called the Peerless Jubilee Singers. There was also a music hall, and there was Wichita Garfield Hall. So all these were places that African Americans in Wichita could rent the space and have their own event. In Wichita, where one was called the Lincolnian Group. Some of the names in 1880, 1899, James the 55, and in 1915, the Whiting, Kansas, they had a Grange 55, and in 1915, the Whiting, Kansas, they had a Grange picnic, and there was a banjo quartet that was hired to play there. And the young people were a little bit upset about this. Because they wanted a brass band, and so that's about the end of the era for stringed instruments.